Hey everybody, and welcome to another month in review. So this is a series of videos where I talk about all the new to me games I've played during the month, of course this month being October 2021, and I rank those games from my least favourite to my most favourite, giving brief descriptions of the games along the way. Sometimes I've already provided reviews of these ones, but more often than not there will be a review dropping sooner or later, so keep an eye out for those. So I've played 17 new games this month from all different years. And I've also played 2 additional expansions. So let's get started with those expansions, both of which I've got a positive perception of. So first off, I played 7 Wonders Duel Pantheon. So this one adds god powers to, obviously, 7 Wonders Duel. And I like the way you acquire these god powers, because in the first phase of the game, depending on which cards you reveal along the way, you can choose to basically skim from these decks and allocate these cards to a different spot on this additional section to the board. And basically, depending on where you allocate those god cards, it's going to be cheap for you or more expensive for your opponent. And of course, your opponent's doing the same thing. So you can kind of tinker where you want to put these cards and make, depending on what strategy you want to go for. And I like the fact that going forward, when these god powers come into play, then you can actually choose to almost pass on the main action or where you'd normally acquire a card in favour of using a god power. Additionally, I really like the change in the third phase, where rather than using the guild card, you have these kind of really special cards that you can build to get a lot of points. So I liked it. Not too much fiddliness and not too much overhead to add to the base game, so I'd probably more often than not play with this expansion. The second expansion I played was Thingvelia, which is the first and only expansion so far for Nidavellir. That one's being a really cool kind of bidding game as you're acquiring cards to score points in a ton of different ways depending on the suits of cards that you get. This one adds a new thing to go for, as you can collect these artifacts, all of which are really interesting, and I also like these special character cards that you can get, just adding more variety, different paths to victory, and again, next to no overhead in compared to the base game. So not too much fiddliness, and another expansion I'd probably play with every single time. So 2 very nice expansions there that I would recommend picking up if you're a fan of the base games. But let's get started with the actual main bulk of actual main core games. So first off, at number 17, I have Hit the Silk, which is actually a 2021 release, so brand new Kickstarter game. This one has a cool theme to it, where you are trying to, I suppose you're in a group of burglars or bank robbers doing a big heist, and you're basically on this plane that's about to crash, and you've got to get your share of the money, but there are only so many parachutes on the plane for, I think it's like 1 or 2 fewer players than actual is in the game. So you're going to have to leave some players high and dry and make sure that you're in a position to not only have money, but also to have a parachute to escape safely. So you've got a little bit of negotiation there, but fundamentally this game has a lot of take that in it. It's one of those games that I think that it tries to really sell itself on the theme and the idea of it, where the actual mechanisms and gameplay are pretty lackluster. It feels dated. It does feel pretty nasty at times, just for the sake of it. The scoring, in-game scoring, is a bit of a mess, and to be honest, the whole game in general is a bit of a mess. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like a satisfying game and have any really interesting decisions on it. I just kind of sat back and just kept a hold of my parachute, kept hold of some money, and ultimately did okay just doing that. So not very exciting, and a bit of a botch of a game, to be honest. So highly recommend you give that one a miss. That one is Hit the Silk. At number 16, I have Hafid's Grand Bazaar. Now, this one goes back to 2017 and is a pretty simple set collection game on the surface of it, as you're collecting cards of different suits, trying to trade them in different areas depending on the sets you have. So do you want to sell a bunch of the same cards? Do you want to sell one of each different colour or something like that? And whatever you do, depending on the difficulty, depends on how many points you get for doing so. But all that set collection stuff is under the veil of a negotiation game. So in this game, you are bidding for these different locations to either acquire cards or to sell things. But also there is one spot on the board that is kind of the chief negotiator. So there's a whole section in this game where you can choose to trade cards with one another, of course trying to aim towards those sets. But if somebody has that chief negotiator position, then every deal has to go through that player, and they have to kind of sign off on that deal to be made, maybe taking a cut of the trade or getting some kind of bonus for doing so. And I really thought that idea was quite cool, where you had this authority figure who did pay for that privilege to do so. But ultimately that was kind of the downfall of this game, because every deal ended up being a bit of a a bit tedious and a bit too much work in order to strike a deal. You know, you just want to make a simple negotiation, just trade one card for one. But of course, the negotiator will stick their nose in and say, you know, you're not doing that, which kind of just draws the game to a halt. It feels a bit more clunky than it needs to be. And despite sounding cool on paper, it just does not work in practice. So the rest of the game is okay, pretty standard stuff. It feels a bit too routine and a bit too predictable on what people are going to go for each round. So ultimately, I can't recommend it, and it wasn't a great game despite having some signs of promise. At number 15, I have Unmatched, Cobble and Fog. So if you're a fan of my channel, you probably know this isn't my kind of game that I'd normally like. So this is a skirmish style game dating back to, well, this particular edition goes to 2020 with these characters. And out of all the different characters and sets you can get, this one is probably the most appealing to me because it has more, you know, it has the Invisible Man, I think it has Jekyll and Hyde, so it has some quite interesting characters from, you know, from old books and folklore, and you are basically just trying to collide with each other and smash the hell out of each other and knock the other person out. But the characters are massively asymmetric. You know, for example, the Invisible Man can teleport towards these amongst these clouds, so you don't really know where he's going to go or where he's going to be, and things like that. You've got like Sherlock Holmes as well, which uses Watson to his advantage and things, or you've got like Dracula, who has these like harpies that can help him. So I do like how asymmetrical it is. The characters do feel very different, but ultimately these style of games just don't normally do it for me. I was expecting a bit more gaminess with this one, where in fact you are basically just playing attack cards and using defense cards to counter those. So pretty simple and quite formulaic about the way it plays, but I think in the right mindset, if you just want a game with a bit of chaos, then it's not a bad one. And out of all these dueling games, this one's pretty good. Nice production, great artwork, and the miniatures and stuff look really good on the table. But yeah, ultimately the gameplay is not something I tend to enjoy. At number 14, I have Ishtar, The Gardens of Babylon. This one dates back to 2019 and I believe is a Bruno Cathala game. And I'm normally not the biggest fan of Cathala games, but this one was okay. This is a tile placement game. As you are collecting these tiles on this rondel system, you are trying to control these pagodas by having these biggest gardens surrounding them. And you're placing tiles, you can potentially overlap those tiles to build these chains. You can also try to fulfill these contracts by collecting gems on the board. This one was perfectly fine. It played relatively quickly, quite smooth in the way it plays. I think sometimes it can be a bit lucky in terms of the way that rondel looks, and just when falling on your turn and you just happen to have a really good tile that's been revealed, and you're obviously going to draft that one. So it was quite paint by numbers, but the rest of the game was perfectly fine, what you probably expect from a Cathala game. It just works well, but ultimately doesn't excite me tremendously, but a fine game. At number 13, I have Kanagawa, which is another Bruno Cathala game. Another pretty game as well, so I can't deny Bruno Cathala games normally do have a very high level of production. This one, no exception. This one goes back to 2016 and is I suppose it's one of these games where you are collecting cards almost in a Coloretto style fashion, as you are laying them out on these rows and columns, and then you can kind of choose to cut your turn off and draft one of those columns of cards, and in order to contribute towards this panoramic painting. And you're scoring points in lots of different ways, such as the characters you're collecting, the different seasons on those cards. But I like the fact that you can use these cards as dual layers, so you are either using them to contribute towards your painting for your scoring, or you can use them as the bottom part of the game to add towards your art studio, which will allow you to basically paint more paintings in your top part of the game. So this does have some quite nice synergy between what you're going to use these cards for. Lots of different ways you can score points, and it has this kind of chicken mechanism to it, where do you want to cut your losses now while you've got a certain criteria fulfilled, or do you want to push further for more points, knowing that you can never go back on yourself to score those earlier points too. So it did have quite some cool scoring mechanisms in it. Very nice production, as I said, gorgeous artwork, but it was pretty standard fare in its gameplay. Nothing bad with it at all, perfectly fine in a game I'd play anytime, but nothing I'd lean to take off the shelf and play, despite it looking so pretty, because the gameplay was pretty generic. At number 12, another game from 2016. This is Mr. Cabbagehead's Garden. So this is pretty much a solo experience, although you can play it two-player. This one is a puzzly style game as you're acquiring all these different fruit and veg in order to build your garden, and you are trying to either paint put these cards down which have different fruit and veg on them in certain patterns in order to score points at the end of the game. And you're also trying to bear in mind that every so often one of these neighbours, which are these really interesting characters, come in and kind of mess with your puzzle and make you kind of mitigate them to try and get around them. And the way you acquire these cards is quite interesting, as you have 3 cards handed out to you at first. You can either choose to pay bees to take from one side of the row, you can kind of take the one for free, or you can actually take bees to take the other card. So it has this kind of cash flow thing where if you have to balance these bees, so you have some in your kitty to spend in future rounds, but bear in mind that if you don't have any, then you're not going to take certain cards. If you have too many, then you can't take certain cards either. So it has this balancing thing, but it works perfectly fine. It only takes 10-15 minutes to play, and for a solo experience, I will every so often maybe take this off the shelf and give it a go, because it's quite satisfying, it's very cute, and it's a bit weird as well, because the artwork is really out there and a bit head trippy. So it's okay if you like your solo games and very simple ones. This is probably one to look at. At number 11, I have a Stefan Feld Games with Arena Roma 2, and this one dates back to 2009. Is actually a sequel to, I think, Stefan Feld's first game, just called Roma. This one is a strictly 2-player dueling game, as you have this board and you are allocating these cards to different spots on the board, all relating to a different dice pip value. So you've got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. You have additional spots as well, which gives you money, additional spots that lets you draw cards. And you're basically allocating these cards, and you're using them depending on the dice you've rolled and allocating them to certain spots, which will either hurt your opponents or let you score points in different ways. You've got to be careful about having money in your hand, because cards, you have to pay money to get cards down there. And I like the way that the winning conditions of this game worked out, because you could either win by having the most points when the points pool runs out, or by making your opponent bleed all their points out of the game. And that's really cool, because when you attack your opponent's cards, if there's ever a gap on those 6 spots, or I think maybe even 8 spots, at the start of their turn, then they are actually going to lose points for each of those empty slots. So you want to be making sure that you're hurting your opponent, but despite this one being relatively in your face and confrontational, it didn't feel that way to a point where it was, it would rub you the wrong way. It was quite Eurofied in the way that this was a dueling game. So you don't normally get that. And if there ever was an example of what would Stefan Feld do if it was a head-to-head confrontational game, then this is probably it. My problem with this game was that it has the potential to go on too long. Sometimes games would be really rapid and quick, and sometimes games would just outstay their welcome and drag on, and it became a bit more of a war of attrition, which for a game this simple, I didn't really want to drag on over half an hour. At number 10, I have another game from 2021. This is Streets. This one is almost a spiritual successor or a sister game to Villagers by Sinister Fish. This one, you are trying to build these streets made up of these tiles, and you've got these different shops and houses, and they all score points in different ways depending on the other shops or the kind of pedestrians in that street. And you can choose to kind of finish these streets by building almost cards like opposite those roads. So you're kind of building roads and streets that are kind of starting and ending, and when they end you score all the points in those streets. They might say score X amount of points for each hipster in your street, or score X amount of points for each kind of commercial shop in that street. So very simple, probably what we'd expect with a light tile placement game. But it did have a slightly different mechanism to it, where certain buildings would spawn pedestrians, and then you can kind of move them around the board at certain points in the game to amp up your scoring. Very quick, very rapid game. It only takes about 20-25 minutes to play. So I thought it was fine. I don't think it was great, but what it does quite well. And for an intro level tile placement game, this one is something a bit different. I think maybe that pedestrian mechanism of moving those people around, it was maybe reaching a bit too far, trying to find something unique rather than finding something that really was fun. But the actual tile placement itself was pretty good on what it did. So not a bad game, not a great game, but it works quite well. That is Streets. At number 9, another game from 2016. This is Archaeology, The New Expedition by Phil Walker Harding. This is a simple set collection card game, as you're trying to collect all these different artifacts and cash them in at certain points, depending on the size of that set, to get more and more points. But the thing about this game is it has a real thread of push your luck in it, where at certain points in the game where you draw this card, there'll be a sandstorm, which means you have to lose half the cards that you've collected, which is obviously a really bad thing. So, do you want to get quick grabs and trade them in while they're worth the points? Or do you want to really gamble to get the bigger sets and maybe risk losing them in a sandstorm? So for a simple game, it did work quite well. It wasn't too frustrating when there was a sandstorm, because it's in there, and it really is a kind of a key part of the game, is that pushy luck stuff. I had a slight issue with some of the setups in this game where sometimes you'd have these bonuses where you could collect a bunch of cards, which felt a little bit too powerful for me, because ultimately all you would do on your turn in this game is to draw a card at the top of your deck and maybe choose to submit a set. So ultimately you're only acquiring one card per turn, whereas sometimes you get these bonuses which would sometimes let you draw maybe 8 cards into your hand straight away, which felt a bit too strong. So some setups are way better than others, and I want to try more of them before I can give my final opinion. But the key gameplay is very smooth, it's fun, and for a simple set collection game, this one does work really well. At number 8, I have Cabo. So Cabo is a game that goes back to 2010, and on paper, this game was something that I really would not like the look of. I read the rulebook and I was very skeptical, very apprehensive about how this was going to play in practice. I thought, this has a really strong element of memory to it, which normally is a red flag for me. I don't like memory games. But in practice, this game is remarkably fun and way better than I thought it would be. So this one, you have a bunch of cards in front of you of different values, and the idea is that by the time someone triggers the scoring, you want to have the lowest score. So it's a kind of a golf style game where you want to score as few points as possible, and the game will end once somebody reaches 100 points. And all you're doing on your turn is you're drawing a card off this deck. You're either using the power on it if it does have a power, which could be maybe to look at your cards, to look at our opponent's card, or to swap them over, or you are choosing to swap one of your cards with an existing one to maybe try and get your numbers down, or anything like that. So a very simple game. But I did like some of the twists on this one, where if you triggered the end of the game by calling Cabo, everyone gets one more round. And obviously you're doing that if you think you've got the lowest amount, because if you've got the lowest amount and you do call Cabo, then you score no points. But if you don't have the lowest amount and you call Cabo, you get all the points of your cards plus an additional 10. And then on top of that, there are some really cool twists as well, where you can kind of shoot for the moon, and if you have the 2 0 cards and 2 13 cards, then all your opponents score 50 points and you score nothing. So there is that kind of outlying chance that you could get one of these really cool scoring mechanisms, and the game works way, way better than I thought it would. Really fun, and I'm really looking forward to trying this one at different player counts, maybe with some more inexperienced gamers, because I think if it lands well, then this one could really be a mainstay of my collection and to cater for that very lightweight gaming group. At number 7, I have Elements, another game going back to 2010. This one is a micro card game where you are acquiring points, and it almost has it's strictly 2-player, and it has almost a blackjack feel to it, but rather than always going for the 21, you have like a moving target as you have cards in your hand. You can potentially have cards in front of you, which is going to be your score, or your points value that you're going to have for the round. And the idea is you want to be having the value as close as you can to a value of cards in the middle, because one of your abilities is to get rid of cards from your hand and to play them into the middle of the table, which is the target you're aiming for. But you could actually choose to take cards from the centre and add them to your kind of tableau in front of you. So you always want to be keeping this balancing act between the cards I have and the cards in the middle. A bit like Cabo, you could also trigger the scoring by calling it yourself. And if you do have that, if you are closer to that target than your opponent is, then you're going to score the 2 points. And it's a race to get to 6 points. But additionally, if you think you're going to lose, you can actually say, I'm retreating from this round and I'm only going to suffer a 1-point defeat. So a really small game. I think it only has 18 cards in the game. And for what it does really well. It has some pretty interesting decisions here, some quite agonising decisions at times. I don't think it's got the weight and the complexity and depth that a lot of other games do, but what it does, it works really well. It only takes 15-20 minutes to play. Gorgeous production. This one has these massive tarot cards for some of the best card quality I've ever seen, and it was good. I liked it, and I think it's interesting and it's different, and I always like games that are different, and Elements certainly is that. So number 7, Elements. At number 6, I have Robber Knights by Rudiger Dawn. So this one goes back to 2005, so it was actually one of his original games. This one is an abstract tile placement game, as you are placing tiles onto the board, and at certain points when you play a castle onto the board, you place a stack of these discs, very much like Istanbul, and you can choose to divide those discs out by moving orthogonally on that board, dropping them off, trying to control these different buildings and things to get points at the end of the game. But certain terrains require you to drop more discs than others, and you can even cover certain players' discs up. And once it gets to kind of 4 discs high, then you can't actually touch that disc that tile anymore, and it's locked in for final scoring. Pretty tactical and some good depth here. I like the restrictions in the game, as you have to abide by this strict grid restriction. And it works pretty well. You have to pace yourself not to spend all your discs too early and leave yourself some room at the end, depending on when those castles are going to come out. Really liked it. It works really well, and I think objectively it's a really solid design. And I actually played this game several years ago in a different form called Expedition Luxor. And I think I must have played it maybe in the wrong mindset or maybe not in the best of moods. But this was way, way better than I thought it was, and I remember it to be. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to trying this on all the different player counts. Work seems to scale really well, and I like it. Really, really solid game that's massively underrated. That is Robber Knights, or alternatively Expedition Luxor. At number 5, I have Acrotiri, going back to 2014. This one, a really weird game, and another nice looking game as you are building this map of all these different islands. Really nice table presence by the end of the game. This one has a stronger element of pick up and deliver, as when you place these new tiles, you're spawning these cubes on them, which affects this market. So it has a supply and demand thing, where the more cubes on the board of a certain colour means that the value or demand for those is going to ramp up, and you're going to get more coins if you pick up those cubes and deliver them back to the centre tile. And coins are really important because you need those coins to build these temples on islands, and which is basically one of the main ways you get points. So it's a kind of a contract fulfillment game where you are trying to abide by these or complete these cards, which might say, in order to complete this card, you need one of these symbols to the north of your boat, you need one of these symbols to the south, maybe 2 of these symbols to the east, and 1 of these symbols to the west. And if you find the perfect island for that position, then you can build these temples as long as you can afford it, and then potentially get more actions as you go and place more things, get more endgame scoring cards. A really interesting game that works well. Another strictly 2-player one, so it does have a bit of a restriction, of course a very tight restriction, who you can play this game with, which might hinder it hitting the table. But mechanically, it works well. The decisions are good. The scarcity in these islands are good. I like the travel mechanism in this game, as you have to build these routes to connect these islands together and go from port to port. But sometimes you have to travel through other islands in order to access other ones. So I do like the kind of network in this game and the way that the game does develop. The only kind of thing keeping it from getting my shield of quality is I think it does have the tendency to go a bit long at times, and also sometimes, or especially as the game goes on and the map's getting bigger and bigger, sometimes these contracts will just be automatically fulfilled. They'll have the criteria there without having you to do too much work or having to build towards it. So sometimes the draw of the card is luckier than others, but that's a very minor issue. I liked it, and I think maybe with more plays, it could even creep up to a shield of quality. So stand by on that, and I'll get my review out once I've solidified those thoughts. So let's get into the top 4 games, all of which have my shield of quality. So at number 4, the first game with my shield of quality is Rajs of the Ganges, the Dice Charmers. So this one goes back to 2020, only a last year's game, and of course this one is the roll and write version of Rajs of the Ganges, which is a very popular worker placement game which uses dice to do everything. This one, of course, all takes place on a piece of paper. You are trying to build these roads to connect these buildings together and to pass through them to get points. You're connecting roads to these bonus things. You are travelling down the river to get other bonuses as well. So this one really did have the feel of the board game, almost the entire experience of the board game condensed down to a roll and write games. But I actually like this one more than the board game because of that potential to get these really cool synergies, these cool like domino effect combos. Or, you do this to get this, to get this, to get this, to get this, and you can have these really amazing turns where you get loads and loads done. Additionally, this one kept the scoring system in the original Rajs of the Ganges, where you want to connect your victory points to your coins, and once they connect, it's going to trigger the end of the game, and the winner is going to be the first person to do that. Absolutely love that mechanism. It should be used more, and that was really the USP for the original Rajs of the Ganges, and this one kept it. So really happy with that. Probably, maybe even my favourite roll and write game I've ever played. So absolutely adore it. I think it's great. Check out my review if you like your roll and writes and are sceptical on this one. Maybe you didn't even like the original game. I think you might even still like the Dice Charmers. Very solid, number 4. At number 3, I have Mermes. This one goes back to 2012 and is an older Istari game about building and maintaining an ant colony. So a really interesting theme. It's a worker placement game, as all the worker placement really does take place on your individual player board, as you are acquiring new ants to send out onto the main board to maybe kill insects to get points and food, and you're going to be laying these pheromone tiles down, which is kind of your income of resources. And you can build these routes in order to travel around faster, as you kind of can skim through a whole bunch of these tiles as a single movement point. It has quite nice scarcity in terms of grabbing the best land to get the best resources. You want to be upgrading your colonies so that you get you can place bigger pheromone tiles. You want to be making sure you have enough food in your supply, because at the end of every year you have to feed your workers or suffer negative points. And of course you are trying to go for public objectives as well. So despite really being multiplayer solitaire in what you're doing, this one did have a very tight feel to it. Very little room for error in this one. Not very much turns you get. And managing each turn efficiently is a big part in doing well in this one. And as I said, not much room for error. And if you do start making errors, you're going to find yourself falling behind if your opponent isn't doing so. At first it can feel like you're not going to achieve anything, but by the end of the game, you normally do. A real nice tight game of spinning a lot of plates, but staying focused on the goals you're trying to achieve. And a real nice throwback Euro game that's really hard to do well at. So love this one, love the theme, really solid gameplay, and yeah, really enjoyed it. So that is Mermes at number 3. At number 2, I have another Istari game. This one is Ys, just Y-S, not the easiest game to pronounce, but this one goes back to 2004, so quite an old game now, and probably one of the most fun Euro-style games that I've played, at least in terms of wider appeal to it, as you're trying to use these cylinders with all different numbers on them, and you're using them to claim different spots on the board. You're placing one of these cylinders face up and one face down in each of your turns. So you've got this element of bluffing as well, where you might be using your 0 cylinders to claim a region, and your opponent might think it's one of your strong ones, or vice versa. And on top of all of that, you are trying to manipulate this market so that all the gems you've collected by controlling these regions are going to be worth the most points, and all the other people are doing this at the same time. So are you going to use these cylinders to control these quarters of the board? Are you going to use them to manipulate the market? And even those quarters of the board are divided up into 3 other sections where you can get additional bonuses as well. There's so many things you can go for here. Really interesting player cards that you can collect and give you powers. Just a really smooth, fun experience that I would highly, highly recommend. Massively underrated, criminally so, and a real hidden gem. So that is Ys at number 2. And the best game I've played this month is a classic, go back to 1997. This one is Tigris and Euphrates by Rainer Knizia. So this one, you might think, why haven't I played so sooner? Simply because I had Yellow and Yangtze. Yellow and Yangtze was the modern version of Tigris and Euphrates, with some very minor differences, and I actually prefer Tigris and Euphrates noticeably more than Yellow and Yangtze. Not loads more. It was a tough decision to decide which one to keep. I've decided to keep Tigris and Euphrates because I think it's a little bit more intuitive. So this one is a really strange game. It's quite hard to wrap your head around at first. But ultimately it is simple, but again, it's a bit different. And the idea is you're trying to collect all these different points by placing tiles on the board and trying to control different cities. And you have 4 different types of points, all represented by a different colour. And at the end of the game, your lowest of those 4 different types is your final score. So you want to be making sure that you're not neglecting anything, and you want to be making sure that all your points are balanced so that you score the maximum amount of points you can. And this is quite a conflict-heavy game, very confrontational, as you are maybe potentially connecting these cities and having these big walls where you're contributing tiles to kind of stay in control of those cities. And for each tile that you eliminate for your opponent, you're going to get that matching colours points. So very swingy at times, but very dynamic game as the board state is constantly changing and tiles are popping up everywhere. Really, really great game. An absolute classic, one that I'll play for years and years to come. Dated so well. And if it does appeal to you, you don't mind a bit of confrontation in your games, check out my review. I was on the fence with it because normally I don't like too much conflict in my games, but this one just works beautifully. Such a great game. Probably one of the best Knizia games I've ever played, and that's saying something because I really like him as a designer, and I know this one is regarded as one of his best, and I can't disagree with that. So yeah, that's Thingvelia Euphrates, my best game that I've played in the month of October in 2021. So that's 17 games plus 2 expansions there for you. So if there's something interesting here, as I said, go check out those videos. If you have enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other content too. I apologise if I sound a bit weird today. I'm full of cold and I'm not very well. But hey, c'est la vie. So for everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye now.